And we're live. I'm Joe Murphy, the director of the Center for Innovative Pedagogy at Kenyon College, and we are virtually connecting outside the Republica conference in Berlin, Germany. On-site folks, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Jim Groom, and I'm here. This is my third time I'm virtually connecting, and I'm happy to be back.
Great.
Hi, I'm Kristen, the on-site buddy for today's session. I just remember when we started this session, my first virtually connecting session was virtual with, I think, DLearn 2015 with you and Adam Kroom.
That's correct, yeah.
This is like,
things
are coming together now.
That's right. That's when I used to.
One of the best sessions we ever had.
Wasn't for me.
That's why we asked you not to come.
Put a lot of pressure on here. You know, Maha, you don't make it easy, as usual.
Well, virtual folks, let's introduce ourselves. Maha, you want to go first?
I'm Maha Belli. I'm in the car in Cairo going home, and I'm the co-founder of Virtually Connecting.
Taskeen?
Hi, I'm Taskeen. I'm from South Africa, but I'm currently in Cambridge doing my PhD. And yeah, it's my first virtually connecting, so let's see how this goes.
Great, welcome. And Terry?
Hi, I'm Terry Green. I work at eCampus Ontario, and I'm in Peterborough, Ontario right now. And I'm a virtually connecting fan.
Wonderful. Jim, Christian, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're learning at the conference?
When to be quiet.
Yeah, strategic silence. That was the word for
exactly.
It. I'll tell you, I'll start. And I think we were at the same session. Dana Boyd kicked off the conference with her keynote presentation. I thought it was a pretty brilliant overview of the current kind of need for digital literacy, but also the ecosystems of disinformation. And I really liked her talk. And if you can, it's going to be streamed and available online. I recommend it because she does a really good job of hitting these kind of pinpoint examples of since 2008, 2009, we start to see the emergence of troll culture being just the kind of those weird people on 4chan to it a real strategy to kind of cultivate a culture of disinformation. But you said it best on your Twitter, Christian, so I'll hand it over to you, like this notion of uncertainty as a strategy of disinformation that actually works against some of our, at least in higher ed, assumptions that being critical and asking questions is always a good thing, which is really bizarre but cool. So Christian, does that make sense to you in terms of what you saw?
It does, especially I think the first session was the talk that she gave was great to set the scene, so to say, because this is a 3-day conference and this is not the usual virtually connecting conference even, I would say. So this is more about digital culture. It's been running here and it's been growing for years now. And it used to be a conference only for bloggers. And then it kind of emerged to be this worldwide recognized conference on digital culture and everything related to that. And what she pointed at, and I mean, there's been plenty of discussion going on in blogs, and I know some people have written great responses to her approaches to literacy, like Benjamin Doxdater and others, Renee Hobbs, I think. But she really made this point of what stuck with me is the question: what kind of criticality do we want? Do we just want to question everything, or what kind of intention do we want to do that?
Yeah, I was going to ask that question because I remember that keynote that was critiqued a lot. And I was wondering if she took it beyond that in this keynote. So she was critiquing that we teach critical thinking, but we don't, that critical thinking can then be turned back and white supremacists will use that critical thinking in the wrong ways, right, in the socially unjust ways. And so did she, and the other thing that she was critiqued on, the main thing she was critiqued on, I think, is that she wasn't critiquing the platforms at all, for the ways in which they perpetuate these issues. So I was just wondering if this keynote was any different this time around than the one she had recently.
Well, I'll have to say I didn't see her previous talk, and that was the one at Edu. It was like South by Southwest EDU. Is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't see that. And I did see the discussions, but not seeing the original talk, I couldn't really say how it balances this one. But understanding what you're saying in terms of the critique, for me, the thing that I liked is it complicates the idea of asking critical questions as a kind of unchallenged good. Like at higher ed, we teach people to be critical, but like the same thing that's happening. And rather than focusing on higher ed, she focused on the dispossessed, the people who feel like they don't have a job or a future, and the way in which those questions opened up by various groups that she talked about it in the relationship. And you can hear the ambulance because they know I'm about to hit it. But the actual notion that, you know, serendipity early on in 2005, 2006, talking about early blogging culture, that was a good thing. But here she's talking about serendipity depending upon how you find it. Like that one is the idea of black on white violence as a potentially dangerous thing. And the web opens up something I think we all know, but in 2005, 2006, we weren't talking about it the same way as, you know, the other side of the coin of this new brave world of possibility and connections is also the subversion of that. And I think one of the things she was critiquing is critical thinking isn't enough. What's also important is a kind of literacy around the notions of this infrastructure. And the subtle critique was that I think she was saying educational institutions, she didn't say this, but it was to kind of knock. They're not doing this. They're not thinking about infrastructure. They're not thinking about these notions.
But the other problem with her saying that is that actually notions of critical pedagogy do go beyond that kind of critical thinking. Like this thing exists, right? It's not that you can, I mean, even the people who talk about critical thinking say, yeah, you can use critical thinking and just use it to defend whatever argument is in your head. But there are other ways of thinking about critical thinking with a social justice lens. And when you put in a social justice lens on top of critical thinking, then you don't end up in the kind of place where we're at right now. And I think, of course, there's probably a lot of universities and professors who don't go to that level, but it's not that it doesn't exist and she discovered it. I think that's why it's slightly derogatory and offensive. I mean, I love Dana Boyd, but I mean, that statement doesn't do justice to those educators.
Do you think that was the gist of this talk?
I think she what I got from this, and it's been a while since I watched her keynote at South by Southwest Edu, but I think she framed it a bit differently. She didn't say, and I don't remember her exact words, but I think she said something that critical thinking and critical questioning is at the core of every kind of digital literacy scaffolding framework, however you want to put it.
Yeah.
And that kind of differs a bit, as far as I remember, from the talk she delivered at South by Southwest, where she basically said digital literacy was created to address this problem, and it clearly doesn't, right? So, and I'm, of course, paraphrasing here. So I think she kind of stepped it down a bit, but I see your point as I think let's frame it positively. I think it would really help anyone involved in critical pedagogy and in everything that you do, basically. So it would help everybody in this call, as far as I can tell, would really benefit from her pointing out that these things exist, instead of her saying these things should be or these things are not taken care of, right? So
yeah,
we would all be much more comfortable with the first rather than the latter, right? Does that make sense?
And it didn't seem like she was throwing grenades in it.
I had a question in a slightly tangential angle. So I was at the UNESCO Tech Conference last year, and I think the purpose was sort of to, in a similar way, trying to take it beyond critical thinking. So what is the next step after critical thinking? And for them, a big focus was compassion and empathy building within education and within online education. And the reason for that was sort of like with the internet and these online spaces, they tend to become echo chambers of people with the same thoughts. So yes, there is critique, but then the people who have that same critique tend to just share that value together, and there's no conversations between different schools of thought. And that's where the conversation of empathy and compassion building and actually building dialogue between differences of opinion came in. So I was wondering, is that theme present in the conference?
One of the things that came up in her talk that I thought was provocative and might speak to what you're saying, she talked about that we always talk about the introduction of the human and somehow as grounding. And it, like, you know, AI is a kind of machine-like process and the human helps us. But she said that's not always true. And she used the example of autopilot. And talking about in that example, these pilots can't really even fly the planes anymore. And when they do, or when there's a crash, it usually goes wrong. And on top of that, she's saying what the pilots are there for is to absorb culpability. And so it became the human presence there was just about accountability. It wasn't about them actually doing the job. So in that regard, it wasn't about empathy. It wasn't about the human. It was about, I don't know what it's about. For me, that was one of the deeper problematic but interesting parts of her talk. Like, I don't know if it's a question of she was approaching this from the moment of empathy. I think she was talking about it the way in which the structures in which we've built, in which we've become dependent upon, are driven by platform capitalism, and our notions that we need to get away from them or introduce the human at this point may not even be a solution or a necessarily only good solution. So I think when I think about what Maha's saying and what you're saying, Taskeen, it does open up, you know, I don't think she's going that route that you said was happening in UNESCO last year at all. I think it's a different route. Does that make sense? I mean, that one about the autopilot was weird, right? It was interesting, though.
I was, when I listened to her, I was just wondering, how do you say that? What the overall motive is, the overall aim in her thinking. What is she working towards to? What is her ideal state, if there is such a thing, or utopia, if you want to call it that, right? So what is it? Why should we care? I think that's kind of the question, or I was hoping that she would, and I think that would help us all discussing what she said easier. If she were to provide an overall aim, motive, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, hi, Greg.
Hello.
That's what I found so far. I think people think education will solve problems like no. I think she's trying to tell us that where we're at right now is not something that we know the solution to. That we thought we knew the solution. That solution isn't working because that's where we're ending up now. I think. I haven't even heard those similar to the other.
They're breaking up a bit, Maha. But I think what you were saying, and you please do jump in, was that we kind of overload education, kind of. That's at least what stuck with me. What
the solution for everything.
Let's just pretend education is it. Was that about it?
I mean, yeah, I don't think necessarily overload, but assume that education will solve the problems. And so far it hasn't. And she's trying to explain why white supremacy, even educated people can have those mindsets. Because education, because some of the things we teach in education don't go far enough.
I do think one of the things that came up in the talk, and it might get to what you're saying too, Taskeen, or the question you had, is this notion of, you know, opening up questions of uncertainty and questioning. But she was talking about this epistemological violence around networks and the way in which the very way our knowledge is created and how we understand it has as much to do with our positionality and where we are and who we are and our relationship to power as it does with facts and evidence and truth. And for that, I thought it was a really, I mean, I think the model she's framing is a dynamic model. And it's not simple, and she's not just saying like critical thinking is wrong or the education has failed us. She's talking about the real kind of calculus of the way these networks work and how complicated they can be. And I think for that, her talk really, it focused on examples. It was really accessible, but I didn't feel coming out of it like, damn, you know, we have failed as educators. I felt more like I finally have a better overview of the broader frame for the last 10 years of some of the ways a troll kind of transformed from the kid in the basement as we imagined them to a kind of an organized, army of disinformation. And I think it was a pretty good talk using very focused examples of that. But I didn't get the sense that, education came out as the failure. I just think there's limits to framing critical thinking as the only way at it, or even where that leads epistemologically. Mm-hmm. So, but I would say to her credit that the way in which the talk was so accessible was impressive. It's all right. We're about to get a screw gun here going.
So we might have to
That's
move
not a metaphor.
Meters. No, it really isn't. But we're just moving down the street a bit and see what happens. Hope we won't ban too many faces.
I haven't seen Berlin, so it'll be nice to have a short tour.
Yes. We're gonna
we'll do a tour.
Look at this. I like this.
Yeah, that's the new model for virtually connected.
I'm gonna trip over this curb. One second.
We should.
All right.
Virtual
Let's do it on top of the garbage. We're gonna be virtually connected with garbage can.
Well, we've called it.
Yeah, just somebody look out for the cars. Yeah, we don't want you to get hurt.
We're going to tape our.
This is our standing desk in Berlin.
Tell us about other stuff at the conference.
Not West Berlin.
I will say one of the other things. So Dana Boyd's talk, I'll have to go back and watch the South by Southwest Edu one to see, because I haven't seen it, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But I just saw another talk by a woman whose name is Orit Halpern, and she's at Concordia University in Canada, and she's a sociologist. And man, her stuff was amazing. I mean, it was kind of like post-structuralist, and I think the people there were like, what the hell? Because the presentation was a bit awkward. It was like reading a paper. But she was talking about the whole derivative economy of 2008 and 2009 that led us to that financial implosion, and how that's mapped on top of not only the notion of the smart city, but the notion of the web and development. And it was really a brilliant talk. And it talks about this whole idea of resilience, kind of like we talk about grit in higher ed or education in general. And it just her whole theory is about resilience and how problematic that theory is for the way in which we imagine cities, the way we imagine development, computer science, you name it. Just super smart talk about all this stuff. And she's at least she's in Canada right now at Concordia. And I recommend that talk as well, because that was a really good one.
It was really interesting. I'll need to look that up. I'm familiar with some of the critiques of resilience in the educational model, which the ones that I've read basically boiled down to some people are using their resilience on things that are not math homework. So I think it'd be interesting to see some of those critiques built out more broadly.
It was cool because one of the things she said about resilience that I really liked was the way in which resilience becomes a financial model. So she showed this model, right, of New York City right before Sandy. And I don't know how many of you know about Sandy in New York City, but it was a devastating kind of super hurricane. And they talked about these models where, you have this major kind of, flood or what have you. And these condos, these high-end condos like float. And people walk up to the top of the building and the helicopter comes and there's no wind and everything is perfect. And resilience is not about like building a sustainable ecosystem. Resilience is about making sure that you can still almost profit on top of the vision of apocalypse. So it's this weird, trippy idea of resilience as a market to frame like, yeah, everything's going to shit. Everything's going to flood. Everything's going to be dead. But wait, there's a way for you to build a model that's not only hopeful, quote unquote, but profitable. So resilience becomes almost like a financial model for thinking about a future that's not sustainable, that's not necessarily kind of symbiotic in some good balance, but basically is a space where you can kind of profit. And she talks about these smart city kind of demos where they built entire demo cities in China and in South Korea, that the cities, whether or not they were sustainable or whether they were able to be kind of, they were never thought. They were thought of almost as disposable cities. to prove a point for corporations about how we should design in the future. And that was a really crazy idea. So I'll shut up because I don't stop talking.
Something you just said now made me link it back to the previous discussion on critical thinking. And I was just thinking, in a lot of the new models, I think, I can't remember what they're called. I think alt schools in Silicon Valley, they very much promote critical thinking and creativity and all these aspects. But the purpose of it is still very capitalist. So instead of like critical thinking to challenge or like, you know, to have education for liberation, it's more like critical thinking and creativity so that you can go work in Google and become even more creative and help the creativity model. So I was wondering, it's a similar thing of like these concepts getting co-opted into a very capitalist agenda.
That's exactly right. I mean, and Terry linked perfectly to the site, this idea of hopeful resilience, and she has this book called Beautiful Data, and it really maps brilliantly on top of the idea of, you know, selling the apocalypse, almost like selling the end of, you know, almost like selling the replacement for teachers. And that's where the autopilot and the auto teacher also, so the autopilot that came up in Dana Boyd's talk, and this notion of the AI teacher is interesting because I don't know what that means. Like, I still can't really wrap my head around a lot of it, you know, frankly.
Yeah. And I think what this conference presents really well to its attendees is that you never will be able to, you think you're an expert in one domain, or you think you've heard the most of what kind of discourse is going on around your domain. But then you're just hit with these 12 other things, and you just get home. Try and get home safely, and wrap your head around that. Then. So, and that's what they're doing really well, I think, in terms of selecting certain themes and trying to map them out together. So you always, with every good conference, you always have at least 2 sessions that you want to attend simultaneously, and then there's only this one to go to, and in the end you're standing somewhere in the hallway having these exact kinds of discussions with people, be it online or on site.
The other talk that I was kind of disappointed in was Chelsea Manning. Mm-hmm. So Chelsea Manning was here, and she had a kind of like a candid interview with the interviewee, but the questions, I couldn't really make heads or tails of the questions, and so the answers just became really trite, and it didn't go anywhere. I ultimately left after 20 minutes, but I wanted to hear more about, you know, it made me go back and read a lot more about Chelsea Manning's story, but that didn't capture it. I just don't know if it was coming after Dana Boyd, which is a real kind of like point-by-point discussion of the info literacy, and then to be like, yeah, things kind of weird right now. It was it was not like didn't flow well on top of each other.
It was kind of the German way of doing a fireside chat, to be honest. I think it was what lots of the English-speaking conferences, at least the ones I attend to, do quite well, I think, is kind of set the scene right and ask the right questions in accordance to someone's profile and someone's agenda, maybe even. And we're not as good as that. It was interesting though, but I think that only was captured on German Twitter. The German army was not invited here. They had a stand last year to recruit people, and they tried to do some kind of guerrilla marketing right at the conference while Chelsea Manning was inside and speaking. So it was interesting to have a marketing campaign from the German military while Chelsea Manning inside is talking about.
Did they invoke Chelsea Manning at all?
No, not at all.
No.
Do you know, I thought Germany didn't have an army since World War II, so this is like really silly of me now saying this.
No, I mean, it is complicated, and we are kind of ambivalent towards it, I would say, to say the least. So the West German tradition would be, because, I mean, we were the frontier towards the Soviet Union, basically, right? So we kind of had an army, and we had huge army bases, especially from UK, US, and France. and some of them are still existent, and that's pretty much our army, though, has lots of distinctions compared to most other armies in the world. So we're only supposed to have an army that is for defense. We are not supposed to be even if there is like a national emergency, we will not deploy our army on our own grounds, basically. And people are trying to change that in Parliament every once in a while, but they haven't come through with it yet.
It's trippy too, because as an American, in 1989, I was graduating high school, and I remember my social studies teacher was like, "And if they let East and West Germany get back together, and they get an army, who knows what will happen?" And it's interesting being here, 25 years after that, going to the Wall Museum and just thinking about that notion of, like there's a lot of history in this city, and a lot of it maps on my history as an American, thinking about Berlin and the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain. And it's funny how some of that stuff is coming back around now in some interesting ways. But it's a really cool city to be in, and to think about that stuff in our history and how complicated that shit is. So, although another point, this is a blogging conference, and I smelled it as such, because when I was in Canada, the first blogging conference, I think, or one of the first one, was Northern Voice, which is where I got into ed tech and where I met people like Brian Lamb, Darcy Norman, Scott Leslie, many, many, many people. And it's interesting that, Northern Voice shouldn't have just died, but this one kind of transformed and became like a media conference, and there are thousands of people, arguably, right? I think
around about 9,000 attendees overall over 3 days.
Gigantic. And it has a strange sense of optimism. So while we're talking about, democracy's falling, disinformation, right? There's still people selling blockchain, and there's, a big pool of like green bubbles that people are swimming in. And like, it's weird. Like there's this weird kind of disconnection between like, wow, are we really in a moment of real kind of, I don't know, jeopardy in terms of our institutions based on these networks? And like, hey, blockchain can help you, make toast. It's a weird connection.
I think there's a session on blockchain as a social good or for social optimism, even, something like that. Yeah, and it is quite strange in that regard, and in many other regards, and quite different from the usual virtually connecting conferences, I would say.
Yeah,
that's true.
But I'm not to talk smack on blockchain. Like, I don't know enough about it to even do that officially. But like, it's just funny that that's the thing. Like, I remember being at South by Southwest in 2009, and Twitter was 2 years old. But I remember everyone like, Twitter, like it was the thing. And now it's like, you can see it's like blockchain. So not much has changed. Just the technology.
I was wondering, did the whole Cambridge Analytica and Facebook saga, did that come up in this conference at all?
It has, yeah. Facebook is kind of that, it's almost like the hangover no one wants to admit to having here. Like everyone's kind of like, it's like, oh yeah, I had too much Facebook last night, right? Like, but no one really wants to come out and explain what that problem is. But like, you can feel it. There's a social network hangover, yet it's still very much a conference driven by businesses, people who are in technology. Think about how many people now work for technology that are being funded to come here.
Especially in Berlin.
So it's that, it's kind of that weird contradiction paradox that both Orit Halpern talked about and I think to some degree Dana Boyd. Like there's a real, like, we have a really strange moment where we know what the issues are, but we still have a financial obligation, seemingly, to go ahead with what we know is not necessarily viable.
Yeah. I just attended, before we joined for this session, I attended a German-speaking talk by an Austrian guy I highly recommend called Leonhard Dobusch. I don't think he does much in English, though. Even that, still, he talked about infrastructure for public broadcasting and how German public broadcasting, like the TV and radio broadcasting, is kind of limited in their ways of doing stuff on the internet just because of everything that happened after World War II and the regulation that came with it. And he proposed a public infrastructure that is open source, that is collaborative with kind of Wikipedia as a backdrop, so to speak. And that was interesting, but I mean, I'd recommend the talk, but I think there might even be English subtitles. They might have an English transcript. So what they do well here, at least from my perspective, but I might not be the one who should judge that, is they have a pretty gender balanced conference. So 48% of all speakers are female. They try and look. I'm actually on the bad side of things this conference. I'm giving a talk together with Marcus Diamond, and we're both two males. They actually approached us that we might not be able to fit in because we're two males, which I kind of like, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say that we're still in the program. And they value that kind of diversity to more extent than I usually see at tech conferences, for example.
So we haven't talked much about what you guys will be presenting. Do you want to? I know that you're probably about ready to get back in, but I wonder if you want to just give us a little bit about what you're working on out there.
Blockchain for education. It's going to be the next big thing. We're going to actually, what we're going to do is, I'm talking about what I'm always talking about, domain of one's own. I'm simple, I'm old school. I still think that HTML and the web and WordPress make sense. But the thing I always struggle with at these conferences, and I'll shut up, is, you know, mine is very localized. Like, give students, faculty their own space, try and make them do it. But there's a reason why people use social networks. There's a good there, I think. People feel connected. And I don't know to what degree domain of one's own can challenge and deal with some of those larger issues about the toxicity of search and stuff. I think it goes back to basic digital literacy. That doesn't matter if you have a domain of one's own. It's just using good sense. So I don't know. Like, that for me is always a struggle. But I still think for me, it's how I started and got interested, is using cPanel and WordPress. So I'll keep with that. Christian?
I'm actually stealing Jim's work. I'm presenting it in German. The title of the talk that I'm giving is The Lost Wisdom, why there was more web in earlier days, I would say would be somewhat of a translation. And we're trying to map out the ways that digital technology in learning and teaching have evolved, and why that kind of isn't. Marcus came around to the idea that we should frame it as a normative paradox. So people create something and hope to do good with that, and just the opposite happens, but everybody still claims that the good is happening. And MOOCs are kind of a great example for that. Right, so let's democratize higher education. Let's just keep going with this, even though only bachelor degrees are actually finishing our courses and getting, like, all that. Yeah. I'm oversimplifying now, but that's basically, we're trying to take a historical lens and then see where that then takes us when it comes to decision making for the present and future. Yeah. In 30 minutes, we'll probably make that happen.
And
right?
One of the things we noticed when we were comparing notes before jumping on here is that we're both on Friday, the graveyard shift, because I don't think education's really loved at this conference. I think they tolerate it, which is probably smart on their part. But there's not like a, oh, yes, let's. Although it's funny because Dana Boyd in many ways is, or at least was, kind of part of the early research education frame for this. So I guess that's not totally true. But the sessions are quite diverse in terms of all the things. There's like 6 or 7 tracks. So I mean, you can frame out a conference within a conference within a conference here. It's for that, it's really a good, and it is a very diverse conference. There's people from everywhere, all languages. You hear it. And Berlin's awesome, so I like that too. Do I sound like I'm going to sell the conference now? It's only $385. I don't even know how much it costs because I got it for free.
210.
But 210 euros, which is actually more dollars. Canadian, you're screwed. If you have Canadian dollars, forget it.
You are.
You see, this is going off the rails, Joe. You have to save it.
No, I just like to watch stuff fall. It's great.
You're like Pepe the Frog.
Some people just want to watch the world burn.
Exactly. How about you all? We've been talking too much. What do you think?
You know, I think one of the things that
I think on virtually connecting with Thomas.
You kind of broke up on us, Maha.
The conference is half women. You gotta find women.
Maha, you broke up a bit. And we know you don't drink, so you weren't just slurring your words.
I'm guessing you couldn't understand me.
Correct.
So just ignore me for now.
Okay.
It's okay, just move on.
We could do an art project out of your audio, though, for sure. It's awesome. All right. So everyone can talk about Maha. That's going to be taken out of context.
The thing that I was reflecting on is some of the questions about there's a question about primacy, I think, in a lot of these things that and some of this is building off what Teskin said about empathy as the next step. And I find myself thinking, is empathy maybe a first step, or is step the wrong model? And I'm also thinking about some conversations we've had recently with Mike Caulfield and the stuff that he's been talking about in terms of accumulating domain knowledge as a necessary substrate for critical thinking. So I think there's a natural tendency to say, well, first we'll do the domain knowledge, and then you'll have something to critically think about, and then you can be empathetic. And I guess I don't see that in my kid one, but boy, that's going live on the internet. Great. He's going to love watching that someday. But you know, I think one of the challenges is that for planning purposes, stages help, but maybe we need to think about a more interlocked developmental structure for folks.
I like your frame a lot. I mean, the way of integrating those three, and Mike Caulfield, absolutely. I thought about him the whole time. And I think to your point too, Terry, to build on what Joe is saying there, like the theme is kind of dealing with the post 2000. I mean, if there's a moment, the post 2000 election, 16 election, what's happening with what we talk about disinformation campaigns around the world, the move in Europe and the US to more conservative models, Brexit. So I think a lot of that is the questions that I think are unifying this is how much are these networks responsible for this? And I think that's probably a unifying theme that many people are trying to make sense of. Some more subtle than others, but definitely there. And in terms of what you're saying, Joe, like how we build that into pedagogy and thinking about that critically, obviously there's a lot of people doing great work, but Mike Caulfield comes to mind with his textbook and with his ways of trying to build this in as examples, reverse image searches, etc. A lot of that stuff, you know, now he did a recent thing about, you know, fact checking built into the browser. A lot of that stuff is really like rings true when you start thinking about, you know, the serendipitous relationship of the web and how it can go both ways, for good and for bad. And people like are like, I feel guilty, like for all those times we were like promoting blogging and stuff, but I don't. I don't feel guilty about getting on Twitter. I don't feel guilty about blogging. I do think that we knew that you know, this underbelly of the web and the social was real. The thing we didn't know is how it was going to emerge and what shape it would take. And, you know, I don't know, like, it's easy to say, retrospect is easy to say, oh, we should have seen this coming, we should have done more. It's education, people pointing fingers, people getting pissed. But I think we got to deal with what we have, figure out what way we go forward together. I don't know exactly what that is, but I think Christian does, so I'm going to let him finish that.
I think easy for me to take it from here, isn't it? So I think there's this tendency, and it's not a tendency, it's more than that. It's a real trend to, in this neoliberal kind of way of thinking, to shift responsibility down the hill to the end user, to the student, to whoever you're talking about on the web. And they're supposed to develop some kind of literacy now, or some kind of understanding of what the web actually does to them, with them, and what they can do with it. And I think that undermines any kind of discussion of what regulation should be doing, of how we should, what kind of infrastructures we should be building and providing. And that's basically what your work is about, to large extent, I would say, actually. To not leave people standing in the rain when they have to deal with this crap, and to provide some kind of framework and help with that. Because even though we didn't know, we gained some experience from looking at this. And there are some people who at least told us earlier than others, as now. Like I'm thinking of Audrey Waters might be the most prominent example, but there are plenty of others who do critical work and who point at stuff going wrong. Chris Gilliard is one of them. Benjamin Doxdater does some great writing. If you're at all into education and any kind of technology, you should read them. So there are some people where you would be able to point to and say, we should be smarter because of what has happened, and not shift it to this, not just pretend it never happened and move on.
And the final question on that, and it's a good one, and I think this is the question that Dana Boyd ended with, because I was struck by her talk. I thought it was really solid, or at least it had me thinking. I'm sure people could poke holes in it, but it did get me thinking. Is she said, like, despite after all is said and done, how much of these systems that we're talking about right now are dependent upon ad-based revenue, capitalism, etc. And the question really comes back to, larger economic platform capitalism systems that a lot of people you talk about who've been critiquing, and what's our ability to disinvest. I mean, there's nothing crazy than seeing people on Twitter and Facebook yell about how bad Twitter and Facebook is. It's just, I can't stomach it. Like, and then people are like, you don't really have to leave Facebook because it's not Facebook's problem. It's whose problem? It's our problem. It's your. I mean, there's a lot of finger pointing and I don't know. Again, okay, I'm Christian. You're gonna bail me out. I don't know. But I also think that doing it on Facebook and Twitter, if that's really the problem, you're gonna solve shit. That's just stupid. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe Maha's the problem. Maybe Maha's internet is the problem.
The internet is definitely one of them. Yeah, I mean, that's what we were saying in the beginning, right? We were hoping to, or I was hoping for Dana Boyd to provide some kind of motive of where we should be going with her analysis, and I haven't seen that, and I don't think anybody has, and I think everybody's kind of struggling to find that route.
And it's interesting now we can all sit here in retrospect like that and say, oh, when Mike Caulfield picked it up quickly after the election, and everyone started writing about fake news. And that became the meme, and then we didn't even know what fake news meant. Is fake news the conservative fake news or the liberal fake news? And so, this stuff is happening fast. And I think one of the things that's interesting is, it's all premised on that, on us doing things fast, moving fast, getting information, pushing it out, sharing it, not thinking about it, not critiquing it. And so that's a cultural question as much as it is a, question of the technology or empathy or all that. The question of slowing down and thinking about some of the stuff we're doing and how we're doing it and whether it's necessarily the best way at it. And I think we've gotten into these habits culturally through this technology that we have to struggle a little bit with. And part of that's the platforms we're using to do all of this. So, I don't know. Get your own domain. WordPress is awesome. Reclaim hosting. Reclaim video.
Well,
DS 106.
I'm going to jump in some maybe critical something to say it. So one of the real problems is that we allow speed to ape intelligence. That there's this value that privileges extroverts and people with high social standing and people with good internet connections, and allows us to, some of it's just the primacy effect of who says a thing first in a conversation. And I think you're right, finding ways to slow down and think harder, and to value that work would be an awfully good start.
Is my audio clearer now?
Yes.
Can I say something? I've been listening the whole time. I was just afraid that of the chopping. The other thing about this, who says something first, it's also which privileged person gets heard first. Because there can be people of color and women saying things for a really long time until this one white person who's really famous says it, and everyone attributes it to that person. I mean, I don't know. That I just wanted to say that.
Well, I mean,
really good point. It's not necessarily temporal first. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
No, what you were saying, but the idea of also links because this is a discussion, right? And it links to the discussion of balance and the debate post-development, degrowth. I mean, I'm not exactly sure, so I'd like to hear more about that, Taskeen. But it's interesting too, because what I always think is, what I thought was great about the Halpern's talk about resilience is how much the history of the 70s and global capital is responsible for some of that velocity before the internet, the velocity of how we think about markets and global trading and all that maps brilliantly on top of this. So that has a lot to do, I imagine, too, with the notion of development in all over the world, right? Different places. I'm not saying that very clearly, but that's because they got trucks behind me. I'm afraid they get run over.
I just so happen to have the book right in front of me. It's called The Development Dictionary, and there's another one by Escobar, and they both talk about post-development and how this whole development discourse was basically, well, after colonialism sort of died down, and the whole next phase of neocolonialism and the creation of developed and underdeveloped. And it just showed how the discourse is always about progress. And so the underdeveloped needs to keep on progressing to try and be like the developed. And that whole framework, it just changed things around instead of looking at like how some societies have actually reached a good stage of balance, and that we always don't need to be progressing and becoming more efficient and faster. Sometimes balance and I think we've forgotten about balance, like just reaching a steady state, and that's what the whole degrowth stuff is. So it kind of flips it on its head. Instead of the underdeveloped or developing countries needing to develop more, it's actually that the developed countries need to have a process of degrowth to slow down because they're moving too fast. So yeah, that's kind of how that fits in with what you were saying.
And if I may just quickly jump in, although there's another truck, maybe we should wait for that first. Sorry about that. One of the main takeaways I think many got at OE Global last week in Delft was that we should try and how would you say that? Bring our knowledge to the developing countries or the global south, but actually make more room to listen and to see how we can adapt that knowledge to our context, and not vice versa. And that's basically one of I mean, our workshop was kind of about that, but I think that around here, it's still the other way around. So it was just announced today that Republica is coming to Ghana, which I think is interesting this year. But people celebrated it as great. They have Republica now. Whereas I would actually be more interested in an African conference, a conference from Ghana coming to Berlin, and see what that is like, and see what kind of knowledge would then evolve and what we would make of that.
I'd add, just in terms of what you're saying about development, which is fascinating, is Orit Halpern's, it's called Resilient Speculation, talks about the ways in which colonialism and imperialism is built into the notion of 70s and 80s and 90s corporate speculation. as a way of kind of furthering those, the trade and the colonial frame into an economic frame. And the map also maps on top of a developmental frame in terms of computing and development. So that term development even has these like 3 stages of life within her talk, which really wraps beautifully with what you're saying. So definitely check out that talk if you can.
How are you on?
I'm fine. If they want to keep on, they like the torture, we'll keep on giving it. You want more? You got it.
What's that called? A filibuster?
Exactly. We're preventing any other. They're holding the conference for us, so nothing's happening until we're done.
I actually wanted to ask another question, Jim. You were talking about how Brexit and Trump and all of these things are very much a discussion that's going around. Just to once again bring in the global South angle, like this year at least, I think 3 to 4 presidents have resigned in Africa, and Cambridge Analytica was also part of the Kenyan elections. But I feel like these conversations are just not had in these places. So even the examples of the critique is very much still around a very global North discourse. So yeah, I think that's also one of the things to be wary of. Like what are the current affairs that are being discussed?
Well, I agree. I mean, it's one of the things, and I'm still going to come from that global North, but all of Dana Boyd's references were always back to America or Germany. So nothing outside of that. So it really felt like those were the 2 poles of existence. And leaving America, but still being in Italy for like 2.5 years now, I just am blown away by how egotistic and self-referential all Americans always are about their politics. And I'm being one, but like, it's just this huge, like, Trump this, Trump that. You got to do, like, it never leaves that frame. And there's not much room, not much oxygen for much else. And that's a problem. I mean, I don't know why. I mean, because also I think it's also promoted by media in other countries. Like, so Italy always talks about the US, and that becomes a central space. And so people want to focus on that. And I don't know where that centrality is always located, but absolutely. I mean, I don't know if your experience here is different, but it's very much still US/German centered because of where it is. And English too.
Yeah. And especially over the last 2 years, it had been better for a while, but over the last 2 years, there's just so much, let's call it news from the US and the UK and countries like that, that there's less coverage of what is actually going on in the rest of the world. And there are crises that have always been underreported. The one in Yemen, for example, might be the most prolific one there, but there's also the kinds of politics that are at play in West Africa, East Africa, whatever region you point at on a map. You really have to dig deep to find news about that.
I'm going to sound like I'm being paid by Orit Halpern, but Orit Halpern did kind of break that. She talked about Southeast Asia, the Himalayas, how a lot of that mining there, it's building these kind of smart cities that then go defunct, is leaving huge swaths of the global South basically decimated. So she did actually very much focus on that. Her talk was interesting in that it was really geospatial. It was about Southeast Asia, Africa, North America, a little bit of Europe, but it was an interesting talk. I think the delivery of it was kind of weird because it was like an academic paper, which you're not used to at a conference like this. But she did a good job of still getting those points across and had great slides. But it's quite a talk. VHS. I have one VHS in the Ski Movie. Yeah, we do take VHS tapes. That's actually a big theme here too. Is VHS is going to be the future. I think Germany's quick to pick up on that.
We're still on Betamax here.
This is fake news, coming you virtually connecting style.
The skin, are you young to understand what they're talking about?
Awesome.
Well, we're coming up on an hour, and I do appreciate your time, but I'm wondering if anybody has a closing question or closing thoughts.
I just want to say I think Jim and Christian should wander Berlin and chat about anything, and I'll watch whatever.
I agree with the comment that we got in the chat that VC should really be, we should push this to as a Netflix series and get ourselves some funding that way, because I'm sure they'll make, they seem to be willing to make 6 episodes of anything, so we should.
I don't think you're wrong. I think like a GoPro, VC connecting in HD, me and you have bikes, and we go around, we're talking to each other on the bike while looking around, it would be a hit. Maha, we could buy you some more. We could buy you some more bandwidth. We can get it going. Forget it. I think you should do that. Bike tours, VC connecting. Mm-hmm. It's the next thing.
And then sell it on VHS.
Sell it on VHS. Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm. I heard you have a scope for it.
We do.
And now that we know the future of the web and the future of virtually connecting coming to you on mailed VHS tapes in the near future, I think hearing that as our final comment, I'm going to thank everybody for making time to be together today. This was just wonderful. And this is Virtually Connecting signing off.